It was a rainy day on the farm when something incredible happened. The ground, soaked from the heavy overnight rain, had turned into a treacherous swamp. In the middle of the muddy mess, a majestic Mustang named Dakota struggled desperately to free himself. His legs were trapped, and with every attempt to move, he sank deeper. Fear shone in his eyes, and his heavy breathing revealed the desperation of a creature fighting for his life. But someone was watching closely. A German shepherd, alert and restless, paced around the trapped horse. His name was Sky, a dog known on the farm for his intelligence and loyalty. He sensed the danger and realized that Dakota wouldn't be able to escape on his own. Without hesitation, Sky began barking frantically, trying to get the attention of the farmhands. But no one came. Time passed, and Dakota looked more exhausted with each passing minute. Determined to save his friend, Sky made an unbelievable decision. He sprinted toward the barn, where the farmer, Jake, kept his lasso ropes. With impressive agility, Sky grabbed one of the ropes in his teeth and ran back to where Dakota was trapped. The Mustang, drained of energy, could barely react. Sky started pulling on the rope, as if he somehow understood that this could help. Finally, Jake heard the non-stop barking. Curious, he followed the sound, and what he saw left him in shock. His favorite Mustang was on the verge of drowning in the mud, and Sky was trying, all on his own, to save him. Without wasting a second, Jake ran to his tractor, grabbed some ropes, and sprang into action. With Sky never leaving Dakota's side, Jake secured the ropes around the Mustang's body and started the tractor. The engine roared to life, and the powerful machine began pulling slowly. Dakota neighed in distress as his body was dragged out of the muddy trap. The mud resisted, but little by little, the tractor's force and Sky's determination made the impossible happen. Then, with one final pull, Dakota was free. His entire body trembled, covered in mud, but his eyes held nothing but gratitude. He turned to Sky and, in an incredible display of understanding, lowered his head, gently touching the dog's snout, as if to say, "Thank you." Jake, overwhelmed with emotion, knelt beside Sky and hugged him. "You saved his life, buddy," he whispered, stroking the dog's wet fur. Sky simply wagged his tail, content that his mission was accomplished. And so, Sky proved that the bond between animals could overcome any obstacle. The four-legged hero had done the impossible, and his act of bravery would never be forgotten. The rain had finally stopped, but the aftermath of the storm still lingered over the farm. The fields were soaked, puddles of thick mud covered the ground, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. Dakota stood unsteady, his legs trembling from exhaustion. His once glossy chestnut coat was now caked in dried mud, his mane tangled and heavy. But he was alive, and that was all that mattered. Sky sat beside him, his fur wet and streaked with dirt, but his eyes never left the Mustang. The German shepherd had done what no one else could. He had saved his best friend. Jake, still shaken by what had happened, walked up to Dakota, gently running a hand over the Mustang's strong neck. "We need to clean him up," Jake muttered, his voice thick with emotion. Dakota let out a deep sigh, as if he understood. He was exhausted, but he trusted Jake. With careful steps, the farmer led the Mustang toward the barn, Sky following closely behind. The barn was warm and dry, a safe refuge from the cold, muddy fields. Jake grabbed a bucket of warm water and a soft brush, starting to clean Dakota's coat. As the warm water touched his skin, Dakota flinched slightly, but he quickly relaxed. The feeling of Jake's firm, steady hands reassured him. Sky, however, wasn't satisfied with just watching. He paced around, his ears perked, eyes locked on Dakota, as if making sure his friend was truly safe. "You really are something special, aren't you, boy?" Jake said, looking down at Sky with admiration. The dog wagged his tail, his expression serious but content. He had done what needed to be done. Just as things seemed to calm down, a voice called from outside the barn. "Jake, what happened out there?" It was Emily, Jake's daughter. She hurried inside, her blonde hair still damp from the morning mist. The moment she saw Dakota, her eyes widened in shock. "Oh my God, is he okay?" she gasped, rushing to the Mustang's side. Jake nodded. He had a close call, got stuck in the mud pretty bad. If it weren't for Sky. He paused, looking down at the German Shepherd, who was now sitting proudly beside them. We might have lost him. Emily knelt in front of Sky, cupping his face in her hands. "You're a hero, Sky," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his wet forehead. The dog simply blinked, as if acknowledging the praise but not letting it get to his head. Dakota, now cleaner and regaining his strength, lifted his head and gently nudged Emily's shoulder. She laughed softly, her relief evident. "You gave us a real scare, boy," she murmured, stroking his face. But just as everyone began to relax, a loud crack echoed from the distance. The sound of splintering wood, followed by a heavy thud. Jake's head snapped up. What the hell was that? Sky's ears perked, his body instantly tensing. Dakota shifted uneasily, his instincts warning him of something. Emily looked toward the barn doors, concern written all over her face. And then Sky bolted outside, his body moving like a streak of lightning. Something was wrong, very wrong. Jake barely had time to react before Sky disappeared into the misty morning, his paws kicking up wet dirt as he sprinted toward the source of the noise. Dakota neighed uneasily, shifting his weight from side to side, his instincts telling him that danger was near. Emily turned to her father, eyes wide. "Dad, what was that sound?" Jake didn't answer. He was already moving, grabbing his coat and stepping out of the barn. "Stay with Dakota," he ordered Emily before jogging after Sky. The morning air was thick and damp, the ground slippery beneath Jake's boots. His heart pounded as he followed the sound of barking in the distance. Sky's deep, aggressive growls cut through the silence, warning that something wasn't right. When Jake finally reached the far side of the pasture, he froze. One of the old wooden fences had collapsed, its beams shattered and splintered across the muddy ground. But that wasn't the worst part. Beyond the broken fence, just a few feet away, a bull from the neighboring farm had wandered onto his property. And it wasn't just any bull. It was Brutus, a massive, muscular beast with a bad reputation. The animal's dark eyes locked onto Sky, its nostrils flaring as it stomped a hoof into the ground. It was agitated, angry, and Sky stood right in its path. "Sky, back off," Jake shouted, but the German Shepherd didn't move. His fur bristled, his stance firm. He knew this was a threat, and he wasn't about to back down. Brutus snorted, lowering his massive head, preparing to charge. Jake's mind raced. If the bull ran wild, he could trample the smaller animals, destroy more fences, or worse, reach the barn where Dakota and Emily were still waiting. He had to act fast. Without thinking, Jake grabbed a loose rope from his belt. "Sky, get him to move," he called out. The dog reacted instantly, darting around the bull, barking sharply to distract it. Brutus swung his head, clearly irritated, but Sky was too fast. Every time the bull tried to focus, Sky cut in from another angle, keeping it confused and off balance. Jake took the opening. He lunged forward, swinging the rope like a lasso. The loop flew through the air and caught around Brutus's thick horns. The bull roared, bucking wildly, but Jake held firm, digging his boots into the mud as he fought to keep control. Sky continued circling, forcing the massive animal to move toward the open pasture. The plan was working. Brutus, now struggling against both Jake's grip and Sky's relentless tactics, began backing away from the barn. Then, with one final pull, Jake yanked the rope and Brutus turned, galloping back toward the broken fence and into the neighboring field. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. It was over. Sky trotted up to him, his tongue hanging out, panting but still alert. Jake knelt down, running a hand through the dog's damp fur. "I don't know what I'd do without you, buddy." Behind them, Dakota stood at a distance, watching everything. The Mustang let out a loud huff, as if he too knew that Sky had saved the day once again. But as Jake caught his breath, one thought lingered in his mind. If Brutus had broken through the fence, what else was out there? Jake's pulse was still racing as he watched Brutus disappear into the neighboring field. The powerful bull had finally been forced back, but the damage was done. The broken fence stood wide open, a gaping hole in the farm's security. His land was now exposed, vulnerable to whatever else might come through. He took a deep breath, wiping the sweat from his brow. The storm had already left the farm in rough shape, and now this? It felt like trouble was piling up faster than he could handle. Beside him, Sky stood tall, his chest still rising and falling from exertion. The German shepherd's sharp eyes were locked on the distance, his ears twitching at every sound. Even though the immediate danger was gone, Sky wasn't relaxing. Not yet. Dakota, still covered in dried mud from his near-death experience, let out an uneasy huff. The Mustang pawed at the wet ground, shifting his weight restlessly. He could feel it, the same thing Sky sensed. Something wasn't right. Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I need to fix that fence before anything else comes through," he muttered to himself. "Just what I need, more problems." He turned toward the barn, already running through what supplies he'd need to make a temporary repair before nightfall. But just as he took his first step, Sky growled. Jake stopped cold. It wasn't just a casual growl. It was deep, low, a warning. Slowly, he turned back toward the open pasture. Sky's entire body was stiff, his ears locked forward, tail frozen. Dakota, too, had gone still. His nostrils flared, his muscles tensed. Jake followed their gaze, his heart skipping a beat. There, just beyond the fence, past the tree line that bordered his land, something moved. At first, it was just a flicker, a shift between the trees, the kind of thing you could easily dismiss as a trick of the light. But then, clearer this time, he saw them. Two figures. They were standing just inside the tree line, partially hidden in the shadows. Watching, Jake's stomach tightened. His first instinct was to think it was a couple of lost hikers, maybe some kids messing around. But no, they weren't moving. They were standing too still. And worse, they knew they'd been seen. One of them turned, whispering something to the other. Then, without hesitation, they vanished back into the woods. Jake clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the rope still in his hand. Cattle thieves. Emily had warned him weeks ago that there were rumors, stories of livestock disappearing from nearby farms. At the time, Jake had waved it off. He figured they were too far out for anyone to bother. But now he wasn't so sure. Sky's growl rumbled again, quieter this time. The German shepherd stepped forward, as if ready to chase after them. But Jake reached out, resting a hand on the dog's head. "Easy boy," he murmured, keeping his voice calm. He wasn't about to go running into the woods after strangers. Not yet. Instead, he turned back toward Dakota, who was still tense but watching him closely. Jake took in the Mustang's strong, steady frame, his silent trust in him. And in that moment, Jake made a vow. Whoever those men were, whatever they were planning, they wouldn't take this farm. They wouldn't take Dakota. Not while he and Sky were here to stop them. The weight of the moment settled on Jake's shoulders as he stood in the muddy pasture, staring at the tree line where the two strangers had vanished. The farm had always been his sanctuary, his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. But now it felt different, felt like a target. Sky hadn't moved, his sharp eyes still locked on the distance, his body tense with anticipation. Dakota, too, remained restless, his ears flicking back and forth, nostrils flaring as he picked up scents only he could understand. Jake took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. He couldn't ignore this. Turning on his heel, he strode back toward the barn, Sky trotting closely at his side. He had work to do and he needed to do it fast. The moment he stepped inside, Emily was waiting. "Dad, what's going on?" she demanded, her arms crossed, worry written all over her face. "Sky ran off like a bullet, and then I heard you shouting. And Dakota, he won't calm down." Jake glanced at Dakota, who was now pacing near his stall, still anxious. He sighed, running a hand over his damp forehead. "Fence is down," he muttered, reaching for his toolbox. Brutus broke through. But that's not the real problem. Emily frowned. Then what is? Jake hesitated. He didn't want to scare her, but she needed to know. We had visitors, he said finally. 2 men, watching from the treeline. Emily's eyes widened. You think? Yeah. Jake's voice was firm. Cattle thieves, or at least they were scouting. They didn't expect to be seen. A heavy silence filled the barn. Then, Emily shook her head. This isn't good, Dad. We're too far out for the sheriff to get here in time if something happens. Jake knew she was right. Out here, in the middle of open land, they were on their own. Sky let out a soft growl, drawing their attention. The dog's ears were still perked, his tail stiff. He wasn't letting his guard down. Jake squared his shoulders. We need to be ready. Securing the farm. The next few hours were a blur of hard work. Jake and Emily worked fast, reinforcing the broken fence, checking the barn locks, and making sure every vulnerable spot on the property was secured. Jake grabbed his old hunting rifle from inside the house, checking the chamber before setting it near the front door. He hadn't fired that thing in years, but if it came down to protecting his farm, his animals, his family, he wouldn't hesitate. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Sky never left his side. The dog was constantly on alert, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Even Dakota, usually calm by this hour, remained uneasy, his large frame shifting restlessly inside the barn. By the time darkness fell, the farm felt different. The air was heavier. Every creak of wood, every distant rustle of leaves made Jake's senses sharpen. He stood on the porch, eyes scanning the open fields. Emily stepped beside him. Do you think they'll come back? Jake didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the trees, the ones where the strangers had been. Then, in the pitch-black night, Sky let out a low, menacing growl, and in the distance, a shadow moved. Jake felt his pulse spike. They were here. The night was thick with tension. The usual sounds of the farm, the distant calls of crickets, the soft rustling of leaves, felt muted, swallowed by an eerie silence. Jake stood frozen on the porch, his grip tightening around the rifle resting at his side. Beside him, Sky stood rigid, his body tense, ears pricked forward. The German shepherd's fur bristled along his spine, his growl deep and steady, a primal warning. He sensed them. Emily took a cautious step back. Dad, do you see them? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Jake narrowed his eyes, scanning the darkness. The only illumination came from the dim porch light, casting long shadows over the yard. For a moment, nothing moved. And then there, a figure, just beyond the fence line, barely visible against the darkened treeline. Watching, waiting. Jake inhaled sharply. They had come back. He stepped forward, planting his boots firmly on the wooden planks. I see you, he called out, his voice cutting through the still night air. You're on private land. Turn around and leave now. Silence. No movement. No response. Jake's pulse hammered in his ears. His instincts screamed that whoever these men were, they weren't just here to look. Then a second shadow shifted. Jake's breath caught as he realized there were at least 2 of them again. Maybe more. A sharp bark shattered the silence. Sky lunged forward, growling fiercely, his body coiled like a spring. His teeth flashed in the porch light as he barked again, a furious, territorial warning. And finally, the figures moved. Jake watched as they turned, slipping back into the trees. It wasn't panic that made them leave. No, this was planned, calculated. They weren't running. They were testing. Jake clenched his jaw. They weren't done here. They'll be back. He didn't even realize he'd spoken the words aloud. Emily swallowed hard. Dad, what are we going to do? Jake exhaled, forcing himself to stay calm. We get ready, preparing for the worst. The moment the shadows disappeared into the woods, Jake went to work. He grabbed extra floodlights, setting them up around the barn and along the fence line. The more visibility, the better. He double-checked the barn doors, the house locks, the gates. Every weak point had to be secured. Dakota remained on edge, pacing in his stall, his large frame restless. He knew danger was near. Sky didn't let up either. He refused to rest, circling the property, sniffing, listening, waiting. His body was tense, his ears alert. He was the farm's first line of defense. And Jake? He loaded his rifle. A long night ahead. By the time everything was in place, the night was even darker. The farm, usually a place of peace, now felt like a battleground waiting for the first shot to be fired. Jake sat on the porch, rifle resting across his lap. Sky sat at his feet, eyes never leaving the treeline. Emily sat beside them, arms wrapped around herself. "Do you think they'll come back tonight?" Jake exhaled slowly. "I don't know. But if they do..." He ran a hand through Sky's fur. "We'll be ready." And as the wind howled through the trees, Sky let out another low growl. Because somewhere in the darkness they were still out there. The night dragged on, thick with tension. Jake sat on the porch, rifle in his lap, eyes fixed on the treeline. Sky sat beside him, his ears twitching at every distant rustle. The floodlights cast eerie shadows over the yard, illuminating the barn, the fence, and the muddy path leading to the open fields. Inside the barn, Dakota remained restless, his hooves shifting against the hay-strewn floor. He could sense it too, the feeling that something wasn't right. Emily had gone inside, but Jake knew she wasn't asleep. How could she be? They were waiting for the next move. Then a sound. Not from the trees this time, from the barn. Sky's head snapped toward the structure, his body stiffening. A faint metallic clatter. Something or someone had disturbed the equipment near the far side of the barn. Jake's grip on the rifle tightened. They weren't coming from the front. They were already inside. Without a word, he rose to his feet, moving with controlled, silent steps. Sky followed, his movements low and deliberate, a predator tracking an intruder. The barn loomed ahead, its doors locked, but that didn't mean nothing had gotten in. Jake pressed his back against the wooden wall, steadying his breathing. Sky positioned himself beside him, waiting for the signal. Then, from inside, a slow creak. Someone was moving. Jake didn't hesitate. He swung open the door, stepping inside with the rifle raised. Sky burst forward, teeth bared, growling deep and low. For a moment, all Jake saw was darkness, the lanterns flickering against the wooden beams. The scent of hay and damp earth filled the air. Dakota snorted, backing up, his massive body shifting uneasily. And then movement. A shadow darted toward the far exit. Jake didn't get a clear look, but he saw enough. A figure, tall, fast, dressed in dark clothing. The second the light touched him, he bolted toward the open window near the back of the barn. Sky was faster. The German Shepherd lunged, his powerful legs carrying him across the barn in an instant. He snapped at the intruder's boot, just missing as the man scrambled through the opening. A muffled curse rang out as the stranger hit the ground outside, rolling in the dirt before taking off into the darkness. Jake rushed to the window, but by the time he reached it, the man was gone. Silence. Only the pounding of his own heartbeat filled his ears. Sky stood at the window, growling into the night, his tail high, his posture stiff. He wanted to chase. He wanted to finish this. Jake clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of the wooden frame. His eyes scanned the darkness beyond the barn, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the empty night. He exhaled, stepping back. His grip on the rifle loosened, but his unease didn't fade. Because now he knew. They weren't just scouting anymore. They were inside. And next time, they wouldn't be running. Jake stood frozen in the dimly lit barn, his pulse still hammering in his ears. The intruder had been inside, not lurking by the fence, not watching from a distance, inside his barn. That changed everything. Sky remained by the window, his deep growl vibrating through the wooden walls. The German Shepherd's fur bristled, his tail rigid, his sharp eyes locked on the darkness beyond. He wanted to chase. He wanted to hunt down whoever had dared step onto their land. Dakota snorted anxiously from his stall, stomping his hooves against the dirt floor. The Mustang sensed the shift. He knew danger had come too close. Jake ran a hand over his face, steadying himself. He had to think, had to be smart. They weren't done yet. He took a slow step toward the barn doors, scanning the space for anything out of place. And that's when he saw it. Near the workbench, just beneath the flickering lantern light, a knife. Not his, not Emily's. A hunting knife with a black handle, partially buried in the dirt as if it had been dropped in a rush. Jake's stomach tightened. The man who had been here had lost this. He had been close enough to drop a weapon, close enough to make a mistake. And that meant one thing: they had been inside for a reason. A message left behind. Carefully, Jake picked up the knife, turning it in his hand. The blade was clean, sharp. Whoever owned it had meant business. He exhaled slowly, then turned to Skye. "We're not waiting anymore." The German shepherd's ears perked, as if understanding. Jake strode out of the barn, the cool night air hitting him like a wave. His eyes swept over the property, the faint glow of the floodlights barely pushing back the darkness. Somewhere out there, they were watching, waiting. He made his way back to the porch, where Emily stood, her arms wrapped around herself, worry etched into her face. "Dad? What happened?" Jake held up the knife. He was inside. Her eyes widened. "Inside? Oh my God!" Jake nodded grimly. He left in a hurry, but not before dropping this. He tossed the knife onto the porch railing. "They're not just casing the place anymore, Em. They're getting bolder." Emily swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Jake's gaze shifted back to the tree-line, his jaw tightening. "We make sure they don't come back." Setting the trap. For the next hour, Jake and Emily worked silently, efficiently. They weren't just securing the property anymore. They were setting a trap. Jake placed hidden tripwires along the broken fence, enough to alert them if anyone crossed. Skye patrolled the property relentlessly, sniffing, tracking, watching. Dakota, though still uneasy, remained in the barn, his instincts sharp and ready. And then the last piece. Jake took the knife, the one the intruder had dropped, and planted it back in the dirt near the barn. Only this time it was positioned just right in the moonlight. A message. "Come back for it. I dare you." The farm was no longer a passive target. Now it was a battlefield. As Jake stepped back onto the porch, rifle slung over his shoulder, Skye sat beside him, his gaze never leaving the darkness. Emily exhaled slowly. "You think they'll take the bait?" Jake didn't answer. He didn't have to, because in the distance a branch snapped, and Skye's growl deepened. They were coming. The air was thick with anticipation. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer. Every distant rustle sounded sharper. Jake stood on the porch, his fingers resting near the rifle's trigger. Beside him, Skye remained tense, his growl barely audible but ever present. Somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond the barn, they were watching. The knife Jake had placed back near the barn glinted under the faint moonlight, a silent challenge to the intruders. Would they take the bait? Would they be reckless enough to come back? He didn't have to wait long for an answer. A faint shuffling came from the fence line. Skye's body went rigid. His ears snapped forward, and a deep growl built in his throat. Jake raised the rifle, steadying his breath. Emily, standing just inside the doorway, clutched a flashlight in trembling hands. And then movement. Two figures emerged from the tree-line, creeping forward with cautious, deliberate steps. Jake's heart pounded, but he didn't move. Not yet. He needed them closer. Skye, however, was done waiting. With a snarl, the German shepherd launched forward, sprinting through the yard like a bullet. His growl exploded into sharp, vicious barks as he closed the distance in seconds. One of the men cursed loudly, stumbling backward. "Shit! The dog!" Jake took his chance. He fired a warning shot into the air. The gunshot split the silence. The intruders panicked. One bolted for the woods, but the other, the one closest to the barn, froze. His hesitation was a mistake, because Skye was already on him. The German shepherd leapt, his teeth snapping at the man's sleeve, gripping tightly. The intruder let out a choked yell, struggling to break free, but Skye was relentless. Jake was already moving, sprinting toward them, his boots pounding against the dirt. "Sky, hold!" he barked. Sky, trained to obey, didn't let go completely, but his grip loosened just enough for the man to stumble backward. Jake was on him in seconds. Before the intruder could react, Jake slammed him against the barn wall, pressing the rifle to his chest. "Who the hell are you?" Jake growled. "Why are you on my land?" The man gasped, his face half hidden by the dark fabric of his hoodie. His eyes darted to the woods, searching for his partner, who was already gone. But he wasn't getting away. Not tonight. Emily had grabbed the heavy rope from the porch, rushing toward them. Without hesitation, Jake wrenched the man's arms behind his back, tying them fast. The intruder struggled, but he wasn't getting loose. Sky stood beside Jake, his teeth bared, lips curled in a silent warning. "You're gonna start talking," Jake said, his voice low, dangerous. "Or you're gonna regret stepping foot on this farm." The man swallowed hard. For the first time that night, he looked afraid. And Jake knew this wasn't over yet. The intruder sat on the ground, his hands tied behind his back, his face pale in the moonlight. His partner had run, leaving him alone to face Jake. And Sky, the German shepherd, stood inches away, growling low, his sharp eyes locked on the man. He wasn't letting him go. Jake crouched, rifle in hand. "You've got one chance. Who sent you?" The man hesitated, breathing hard. His clothes were filthy, his confidence gone. Emily stood nearby, gripping a flashlight, her expression sharp. She wasn't scared anymore. She was angry. Dakota stomped his hooves inside the barn, restless. He could feel the tension. This was his home, and he wasn't backing down. The intruder sighed. "We were hired." Jake's grip on the rifle tightened. "By who?" "I don't know his real name," the man muttered. "Just some guy who wants the land. Said to make you feel unsafe. If that didn't work..." He stopped. Jake didn't need to hear the rest. They would have come back. Done worse. His voice was steady. "Tell your boss we're not going anywhere. And if anyone else steps foot here, they won't walk off." Sirens cut through the night. Emily had called the sheriff. Flashing blue and red lights lit up the yard as a patrol truck pulled in. Jake exhaled, whistled for Sky, and let the law handle the rest. A new dawn. By morning, the farm felt different. The sheriff had taken the man. His partner was still out there, but Jake knew he wouldn't return. The fence was patched, the mud was drying, and for the first time in days, the air felt light again. Jake stood near the barn, watching Dakota stretch his legs, stronger now. The Mustang had survived it all. Sky sat beside him, finally relaxed. The real hero of the night. Emily handed Jake a cup of coffee. She smirked. "Think we'll get a quiet night's sleep now?" Jake took a sip, glancing at Sky and Dakota. "I think we're finally safe." And as the golden sun rose over the farm, Jake knew this land was worth fighting for.